Today, we are with Mark Burke, the DA's finance spokesperson, and Ashor Sarupen, who is the Deputy Minister of Finance.
We campaigned in the last election on a slogan of Rescue South Africa. And I really want to take the opportunity on behalf of myself and my colleague, and I think all of South Africans. We not only rescued South Africa, we are rescuing South Africa through the interventions that both yourself, Mark, and you,
100%.
Ashor, is doing within Treasury. You're doing an absolutely amazing job.
Amazing.
Mark, well done.
Cheers.
Keep pushing. Whoever thought that we could have fun for an hour and a half talking about finance?
Imagine that. Hello, and welcome to the DA podcast. Today, we are with Mark Burke, the DA's finance spokesperson, and Ashor Sarupen, who is the Deputy Minister of Finance. Ashor, is it Sarupen or Sarupen?
Well, it depends on your background. I've gotten so used to Sarupen that's how it is these days.
Okay, that's what it is.
So what's it on the Cape Flats?
You'll be able to answer better than me.
Sarupen.
Gentlemen, what a long year, but for you guys in particular, coming out of the MTBPS, stressful. You look like you've aged a little. How are you doing?
I don't know. It seems to me that when you're doing the right thing, it's a bit less stressful.
Yes.
And so I could have been a lot more stressed. I'm doing well, yeah.
I'm fairly certain that the right thing is usually harder. Ashor, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, there was only one MTBPS, unlike 3 budgets, so it's nicer to do it once than 3 times. So it was good. So I'm less stressed, actually. I think I've got less grey hair around this one than I did around the previous 3.
But what's that process like, though? Because, I mean, all we see is budget, and we hear about the different types of budgets, and now we hear about MTSB and skit. What does that process actually entail?
A lot of work.
No.
Look, the job of any fiscal authority in any country is what you call allocative efficiency, i.e. the money you spend must be spent to get the most positive outcomes possible.
Yeah.
And that is the role of a fiscal authority. So all over the world, everyone will say, we can do this, but Treasury won't give us money, or the finance department won't give us money. But the reality is that you've got to choose how you spend your money very carefully. And that is that. So the process is actually quite long and drawn out. In fact, the February budget would already have started months ago because the departments submit their budget bids, and then it's evaluated at a technical level if the new expenditure will produce positive or negative outcomes. So it's a very long, detailed process with multiple role players who are all modeling the economic outcomes, who are looking at it from a policy side, who are looking at it from an efficiency side, and who are doing a whole lot of work. So I wish I could say it was all me by myself, and it was all the Minister of Finance by himself. It's an entire ecosystem around a fiscal authority that really tries to give politicians the best advice as to how to steer the country in the right direction fiscally and economically. And then, of course, it's up to the politicians to make the right decisions.
So I mean, the Department of Home Affairs, for an example, they'll put forward to you a few months before budget day, with our 1 billion rand, we want to do X, Y, and Z. And you guys then, as Treasury then, assesses it. So they've assessed it versus their own KPIs, their own goal settings, and you then, from Treasury side, look at the affordability, the long-term sustainability of those plans, etc., and then approve accordingly.
Yeah, of course. And so they've got to have a good rationale. They've got to identify a serious problem. And very frequently, of course, everybody wants to solve a problem with what you call recurrent expenditure. What does that mean? It means that you're going to do something that'll continue to cost the same amount of money or more in perpetuity. Yeah. For example, hiring new staff. That's easy to say we need more people to do something, but that's a recurrent expenditure. Yeah. And so the question is there an alternative way to do this? If we made a technological investment, for example, would that actually give us the same result without creating recurrent expenditure? And you have to be very careful. We're in a very fiscally constrained country. The budget is very tight. Yeah. We have a lot of government debt, which we've got to pay back and pay down. And so you've got to think about these things, not just from the angle of, well, this is the most fiscally efficient way to do it, but you've also got to do it from the angle of this is actually what's within our means and what our checkbooks allow. Yeah. And so that is part of what we've got to achieve. So it's a really tricky balancing act.
So it's that effective and efficiency, doing something
Basically,
effective, inefficiently. And then where do you then come into this whole process?
I just cheer Ashor on.
Okay,
So you're
Mark.
the pom-pom. You're the pom-pom.
I run interference.
Other than cheerleading. So we understand what the department does because they do all the allocating.
Yeah.
Now, the Finance Portfolio Committee is working parallel to that. So what's your role in what Ashor is doing?
Yeah, so Ashor's mentioned a number of things that the fiscus has to consider. You also at times, and it's a tricky balance, but you almost have this collision of ideology in that if the DA had its way, we would run the country like a business, and that you would look for these efficiencies that he's now described. And if you could, for example, at Home Affairs, make a technological investment so that you're able to reduce your headcount, which is an annuity expense and you have to keep incurring. In any business, if you could, cost that trade, you would make the trade. But often some of our counterparts, and definitely the guys in the opposition benches, would say, no, Home Affairs is meant to be a job creator.
Yeah.
We don't care about efficiency. And so now you've got to find these balances. You have to say, well, how can we wind down this annuity expense over time, replace it with technology in a way that doesn't destroy livelihoods in the short term? And then how do you upskill people so that they actually can compete with, a global workforce in 2025? Yeah. And so the DA's role in this, and by implication my role in this, is to keep trying to be the sober voice that says, we understand that we can't en masse, get rid of state employees, but at the same time, they need to have purpose-fit skills for where we are now, and we need to have a world-class government. I mean, not to compare apples with oranges, I lived in the UK for a big portion of my adult life. And any website you go onto there looks exactly the same. You always know that you're dealing with the UK government, whether it's your visa, whatever it is. And just at that simple level, we haven't been able to attain that in South Africa.
No,
so it almost seems to me that at times we've got a database problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so the continuous focus on efficiency, responsible spending, trying to get good bang for our buck, is the DA's approach to budgeting, and that's the.
I grew up believing that Pretoria was a filing cabinet.
What?
I grew up believing that Pretoria, the city, was a filing cabinet.
That's hilarious.
Because every time you'd ask someone about something, they'd say, no, the file is in Pretoria. The file is in Pretoria. You literally started believing that this place was just a huge filing cabinet. But Alan Winde spoke about this recently as well. And he says that the Western Cape, and I think by virtue of that, even the city of Cape Town is run very much like a business. It's a complete SWOT analysis of our strengths, our weaknesses, the threats, the opportunities, where we can, where we can't, what we should be doing, when we should be doing it. And over the last few months that you guys have been part of the GNU in Treasury, it's clear that you've been able to implement a lot of DA policy in what you're doing. But what has been some of the really great wins for you, just not in terms of result-driven things, but getting government to start functioning more better and more effectively?
Yeah, I think we'll probably speak quite a bit today about some of the things that we're now starting to see in the MTBPS and generally. But maybe what's evident in this cycle, I'll touch on a few things. There's the fact that before the DA... Let me take one step back. I'll articulate some of these wins to you in a moment. But there's something called the Overton window.
Yeah.
And the Overton window refers to what is acceptable discourse. You've got things on the left and on the right you just don't discuss.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that the Overton window has shifted a bit as a result of the DA's involvement in government, and then you get to these things. So the idea that you would have a culture of spending reviews embedded into how you do your budgeting. The idea that every year you'd say, what have we started a few years ago that we've stopped paying attention to but we don't need anymore? Or where are we leaving money on the table?
Yeah.
That was never a culture of our budgeting cycle. It's now being embedded. So the program's called TARS, which is Targeted and Responsible Spending Reviews. And this will become a part of every cycle. Likewise, we've got more than 8,000 ghost working cases that have now been flagged. This was just flagged, so we'll have to follow up and see, how many of those result in actual people pretending to be employees. And there are some challenges in that still doesn't go far enough. We need to get down into the provincial and local level, and we need to get into state-owned enterprises, and across all of them, flush out these ghost workers. But again, the Overton window has shifted. We never even spoke about these things.
Yeah, these are new discussions.
It's happening now. And then probably most importantly, and I'm sure Ash would color this in quite extensively, is inflation targeting which is something that's been proposed by the Reserve Bank, which is independent. The policy arm of government has now adopted this idea, the Treasury has adopted this idea that through inflation targeting, we can achieve some really cool things over the medium to long term.
So I think it's critically important to actually go through and unpack each of those things. But Ash, can you start with the basic thing? MTBPS. What is this acronym? When does this happen? Why does it happen? Why does it matter for South Africa?
Yeah, so MTBPS is the medium-term budget policy statement.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Thanks for asking that question.
It gives you, I'm sure that gives you absolute certainty. It's now clear as mud.
As mud.
Yeah, so if you're writing an exam on this, you can calm down to a panic. And so
Please don't judge me for not knowing.
So in South Africa, the budget, while it's passed on an annual basis, isn't a single-year budget. We do multi-year planning. And so it's a 3-year budget. So we always look at what we call the medium term, 3 years. And so we budget planning all the way to an outer year. And so every year we're effectively not just saying we're moving money around this year to meet priorities, but we're planning then out all the way to 3 years' time. And that's what we do in our budget. So the medium-term budget policy statement was designed to foreshadow what's coming in the February budget so that we can give markets, government departments, civil society, everyone certainty as to what the policy landscape looks like on fiscal policy, on the broad strokes of some of the economic policy things that we're doing, and so on. And it usually happens in October. This year with the delays in the budget, it happened in November. Usually happens in October. It was brought in when Trevor Manuel was the finance minister in the 90s and early 2000s, and it really helps give forward guidance so that by the time you get to February, you're not introducing any shocks into the fiscal environment, and people can do all their forward planning. Markets can understand what the government's thinking is at on its broad strokes, on not just on how you spend money, but on its borrowing strategy, on where it sees its debt trajectory, on one of the key reforms are to drive growth, and those sorts of things. And starting last year, we've expanded the MTBPS to include a chapter on infrastructure as well. So it really gives everyone certainty in the planning space. It also gives price setters certainty. We do things like inflation forecasts and so on. So if you look at the detail, all the detail is there. And so that it provides certainty so that everybody involved in fiscal planning, economic policy, economic actors can really already ahead of a budget know what the broad strokes are and then make their decisions accordingly as well.
That is incredibly helpful. I imagine. I'm just thinking about Liz Truss. Didn't she have the shock budget that sent the country
into a flat spin?
Yeah, so she did a mini budget. And unfortunately, so what she did is she tabled a mini budget that didn't quite explain its funding plans, but did lots of things with tax. And of course, the bond market reacted.
So she was the example of what not to do.
Yes.
And this year's budget, this year's MTBPS, was an example of what to do.
Yes, it was. It was exactly that. So,
because markets want certainty at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
People want certainty. I want to know, as close to it as possible, what my repayment on my bond or my car is going to be, and if it's going to be affected effectively. So the forward planning really assists in ensuring that the guy on the street knows exactly what's coming.
Did you see the cabbage?
The lettuce.
The lettuce. The Liz Truss lettuce.
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell the story? Yeah?
Oh, no, I do not. Would you like to? I just feel
I feel like we can't leave our listeners hanging there.
We should not talk about a female prime minister
or the UK
rotting faster than a lettuce. That's all I'm going to say. What I want to actually ask you, though, the part that I've found most fascinating is TARS. So that's the targeted and responsible savings. How is this different to Elon Musk's Doge? It seems to me it's the same kind of thing, right? You think that in government, there's a lot of waste. You got to chop, chop, chop. What did he do right? What did he do wrong? And
what did he do wrong that he's not there anymore? Or what did he do right?
No, did he actually do it properly?
Yeah.
And how is our strategy different, Mark?
Yeah, I think ours has got the word responsible in it. So that's a big
the key.
Yeah, let's maybe just unpack the two the acronyms here. I think it was the Department of Governmental Efficiency, but it was actually named after a meme coin, Dogecoin. So they found a name to fit the crypto coin. I think ours is a structural approach to how you think of spending more efficiently. I mean, some of the engineers that worked on Doge came out saying, turns out the US government's pretty efficient. Like we couldn't uncover a lot of and I don't think that that's most of African's sense of our government. I think we can see the Tembisa looting and we could just sort of know that something's wrong. Maybe to try and explain it to you differently. We've got hundreds of state-owned entities. I'm going to give you 4 names and you guess which one is fake.
Okay.
You've got the Kalahari Kid Corporation. Mm-hmm. You've got the Water Research Institute. You've got the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller. And you've got the Efficient Spending Institute. Which one of those 4 doesn't exist?
Number 4.
Number 4. Of course, that would never exist under the ANC, an Efficient Spending Institute. But the other 3 do exist.
But what's the first one?
The Kalahari Kid Corporation.
What does that do?
I have no idea.
Kid isn't a baby goat.
Yeah, kid, K-I-D.
Tell me.
It's not in the National Treasury, I can tell you that.
And of course, each one of these government entities has its own little executive class. And of course, they run training workshops and seminars that don't actually result in much. Mm-hmm. But also at a fundamental level, I think South Africans are just like, you guys are wasting money. Stop it. And so TARS is an attempt over time to rectify that anomaly of excessive state involvement in industries it shouldn't be in. And within industries and departments that it should be in, what are we doing wrong and can we start doing a bit more efficiently over time? So just in this MTBPS, more than 6 billion rand in savings have been announced. Over 3 years, we've found more than 6 billion rand that we probably don't need.
Glad you found it before someone stole it, though.
And this is the other impressive thing that's coming out of that's such a good point, Angus. It's coming out of this is we haven't now actually gone, we've uncovered these savings, and by the way, we need a lot more than that. The guys need to try harder. But we haven't actually taken that full quantum and chucked it at more spending.
Yeah.
We're actually starting to consolidate our debt, pay off the debt burden that's leading to this high debt service cost of 1 out of every 5 rand. So you're, on the one hand, because we've insisted on it, you're becoming more efficient. And on the other hand, you're doing the responsible thing with these extra savings. And that does sound to me a bit different to what we saw happening in the US.
So I just want to piggyback on that, on consolidating our debt. Coincidentally, right before our talk, I was listening to a podcast where the argument was that fiscal consolidation is basically a neoliberal theory built on a myth. It was
to say that again?
They were saying that fiscal consolidation is essentially made up. Like it's a theory built on nothing.
Yes.
Ash, what does fiscal consolidation mean? Why is it important? Is it actually backed up by experience, or are we experimenting with the South African economy?
So the South African economy is not a place where you experiment because our problems are so big that if you try dangerous experiments, you'll get dangerous outcomes.
Yeah.
So I think there's a realm of things you need to think about. The first is we have a low growth economy for lots of reasons, and we can unpack the reasons. There are structural problems, there are rigid labor markets, there's network industry issues, there's product market issues. So we can go into all of these things, and they all have definitions. The point is we have problems. So we have low growth. And in a low growth environment, government revenue doesn't grow either because you need economic growth to get revenue. So what do? You can borrow to spend, and then you can have a debt crisis, and then you can go to the IMF, and then they'll kind of cut your budgets to a minuscule after you overspent and everything. Or you can go to austerity, where you cut all your social programs and say no more welfare, no more grants, poor people stay poor. And do you like seeing a doctor and getting treatment? Well, nothing for you. You could do austerity is a complete cut of social services to help expenditure and revenue mix. And then you can do the fiscal consolidation, which is where you say, invariably over time, governments will spend money, they'll create programs, they'll do things, and then inefficiencies will creep in. And then you'll find ways to deal with the inefficiencies. And you'll start saying, no business class travel for executives, fly economy, for example, which is one of the things in the ministerial handbook, for example. That's an example. And it's a small example. It's not a big amount. But you start doing all of these things over time that progressively helps decelerate the growth in expenditure, because you can't have your expenditure growth go so far above your capacity to get revenue that your country then ends up in a fiscal crisis. Because if you don't do fiscal consolidation, this is not neoliberal theory, then ultimately you reach a point where you can only pay salaries, maybe some maintenance and your debt. And then you can't do new infrastructure, you can't pay for grants, you can't even do, let alone inflation increases for grants and so on. And so it's actually worse for the poor to get to that point where you have a fiscal cliff. And then if you have a balance of payments crisis, where you basically can't cover your costs in FX, foreign exchange, to deal with your imports and so on, and pay your creditors in international markets, then the IMF come in, because they're the lender of last resort. And if you're at that point, I promise you it's very bad for the poor, it's very bad for the middle class, and it's very bad for the rich. So it's not some kind of neoliberal fantasy, although I wear the badge neoliberal with pride. I mean, I don't, that's fine, call me whatever you want. It is rational policy to say that you've got to consolidate the way you spend government expenditure. You have got to make sure that you get value for money, and you have got to choose to spend your money on the things that make sense. And there's never even if we had good economic growth and so on, there's no unlimited magic pot of money. You can't borrow your way into prosperity. And the same with, if you have a credit card, you can have a very nice holiday, but when that holiday is done, you've got to pay it back.
Correct,
And so government can create 1 or 2 years of good times by borrowing fantastically. But after that,
and then it's time to pay it back.
I was looking at it the other day at the different cities' budgets, the different metros' budgets, and so obviously I think Cape Town's got a budget of like 12 billion rand, and you can easily see where it's going because we advertise it well enough. We know where we're putting money, infrastructure, etc. And then you look at a city like Johannesburg, for an example, and they've got a way bigger budget than the city of Cape Town, but they don't have the basics in place. They don't have clean running water. They don't have constant supply of electricity. I think Johannesburg's only got something like 1 or 2 fire engines for most of Johannesburg itself. And so it's not a case of that they don't have the money. It's this idea of corruption, which is one thing, but also this inability to be able to plan, think about the future, and effectively put money where money needs to go. So it's actually a major problem. And I think based on that, how does our policies really affect the success of the medium-term budget?
So obviously, coalition government is give and take. And we don't get everything we want. As Mark said, if we had unlimited power, we would probably be cutting budgets more aggressively, and we would be looking at a lot more savings. We would want the debt path to probably to the curve to steepen, so you want to decelerate government debt even more aggressively and so on. But you have to come to a point where you meet each other halfway. And I think the balance is now found where we all agree that government debt is too high, for example, and that we don't want a balance of payments crisis. We don't want a fiscal cliff. And so we've got to move away from that. That I think was critical. After one of the steepest climbs in debt for a middle-income country ever, South Africa went from 28% debt to GDP in 2008 to 77.9 this year, and we've peaked it at 77.9.
So can I just ask you, in layman's terms, can you explain that?
In layman's terms, South Africa has a little over 6 trillion rands in debt. And we have an economy worth about 7.7 trillion rand.
Yes, I could.
So basically, we have a problem. It's like
basically we have a problem.
Let's put it this way. Let's just say, imagine your salary is, I don't know, 300,000 rands a year, and you have 200,000 rands in credit card, more than that, 250,000 rands in credit card debt, 266,000 rand in credit card debt, somewhere there. That is the problem. Imagine digging yourself out of that pit. It's not easy. But if you don't do it, let's just say you get to a point where your credit card debt is 300,000 rand and your annual salary is 300,000 rand. And then you've got tax and all of those sorts of things that whittle it down. How are you going to stay afloat? What happens? At that point where you're in your own life, if your liabilities exceed your assets, as we all know, you are bankrupt.
Correct.
So think about economic output in that same sense.
And who suffers in a bankrupt state is effectively the poor, because
More than anyone else.
Because of austerities having to try and cover this thing.
Yeah.
You're cutting on social grants. You're literally making the poor poorer.
So Ash, the only reason I'm jumping in is because I don't want you to slide past it with grace and not pomp. What you're essentially saying is we have managed, together with our partners in the GNU, is to finally peak that. So we don't expect this debt cycle to still be climbing. We've come in and helped to stop, and it's back down from here.
Look, if you consider the ideological posture from the hard left, who believe that we can borrow, as I said, borrow away into prosperity and so on, it's a pretty difficult decision to take for many people. And because weirdly our civil society has lots of these folk floating around, and even in recently the parliamentary hearings on the budget, sort of the criticisms that come through around this from think tanks who are not always certain about their economic literacy.
The left is just far more vocal in South Africa. The far left is far more vocal.
It's not the left; it's the far left. Yes, exactly. So the fact that you got a cabinet to adopt this, it wasn't just the fact that a cabinet adopted shows that the DA was right to enter the GNU, because we have this thing is the fiscal cliff is an existential crisis for our country.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it's not just me or Mark shouting in Parliament saying, "Look, the debt numbers are so bad," which is what I did for 5 years of my life. But the fact that it's done now is absolutely critical for our country. So I think it shows that we were right to enter, and that at a cabinet level, at the very least, the fact that cabinet adopted it tells you that there's consensus around this. And we need to ask ourselves, would there have been consensus if the DA wasn't there? We don't know the counterfactual, but maybe we wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, maybe worth touching on there. I think we've all been to that braai. I definitely, coming from the Free State, have been to that braai where you say, when are we going to start the braai? And they say, ons gaan net nou braai. And then an hour later you're like, when are we going to braai? And they're like, we'll start soon.
I'm around the corner. I'm around the corner.
And eventually they might start the braai, but by that point, and that's basically what happened at the national level. We keep saying until this year that we're going to stabilize our debt to GDP. This thing will peak at some point. Not now, but it will peak at some point.
Yeah.
And this time we said it's going to peak this year, and it's peaking this year.
Yeah.
And so I think that's quite encouraging. There's obviously a lot of work to do. At 77.9%, it's a silly high ratio. And I think just to bring that down a level from this economic term of debt to GDP, if you are spending 22 rand out of every 100 that you earn on servicing your debt or paying off effectively your interest your interest rate on your credit card, it means you can't buy the other things that you need.
Yeah.
And if you were to use this analogy to try and understand our national spending, at the moment our debt service cost is bigger than what we're spending on basic education.
Yeah.
It's bigger than what we're spending on healthcare. It's bigger than what we're spending on security. So this one light item is exceeding major other ones. And unless you start chipping back at the overall debt, which is this debt to GDP ratio, that's large, more than 6 trillion rand quantum that Ashor has mentioned, you will end up in a situation where that 22 becomes 25 and becomes 30, and at some point it's almost the only thing you can pay. And of course, by that point, South Africans will be like, we're not giving you tax money to pay off the debt anymore. And so then the debt will become more expensive, and all of that sounds like doomsday, but it's formally called a debt spiral. But it's the equivalent of getting into a cycle that you can't get out of. And now we've actually, through the DA's involvement in this governance arrangement, we've started to chip back at that. And that is something to commend.
So can I tie that back to our earlier conversation? Is it through TARS that we've managed to save the 6.7 billion rand?
6.7.
What is 6.7? Angus.
We need a younger audience to the podcast. 6.7.
Okay, fine. I am.
Do you know
on
about the
elderly
6.7 thing?
Not at all.
No, guys, come on.
Unpack that joke first.
Is anyone
I don't know it
30
actually.
here?
I just have my teenage sons.
Don't ask Angus. So
Thanks.
through TARS, we've saved 6.7 billion, and that is what is enabling this lower borrowing that's then bringing, am I correct?
Well, no, I mean, that's 6.7 billion in a 2 trillion rand budget is a rounding error.
A fair point. Fair point.
No, it's a start of a process.
Yeah.
And obviously, we'll see. There's more to come from spending reviews, and it's one of the things that I think sort of during the budget fight earlier this year was critical, but it happened, and now it'll gain pace on its own, and that's separate. What enabled us to get to a point where we peak debt to GDP is a couple of things. The first is the long-term fiscal consolidation yielding results. The second is this year the government somehow, thanks to better economic outlook, there's lots of reasons why, better economic outlook, better activity, less load shedding, there was more money in the system than budgeted, forecast. So the forecast was, on tax, you say, okay, we'll get this amount of money in. The new forecast is we'll get 19 billion more than we had intended. Wow. And so those things together create the confluence where you can say, okay, do we hire more political advisors for everyone, or do we deal with the debt problem?
Yeah.
And the decision was made rightly that we will deal with the debt problem. Some of them, there is some, because we got more money, some of it goes to infrastructure and so on. But critically, the debt problem was dealt with. And so it was a responsible choice and the right choice. And to do so while also adjusting inflation downwards is a big thing to do, because obviously we speak about nominal and real. And the nominal number changes when you have low inflation, because you're not effectively printing as much money. So that number that would have been gotten bigger and bigger gets slightly less bigger. And so to be able to peak debt to GDP even with that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's brilliant, eh?
So you've touched on inflation. The other big announcement in the MTBPS was the new inflation target of 3%. Now, to be fair, I understand how many things work. I don't understand this one and the import. What is the big deal? So our inflation target used to be in a 3 to 6% range, right? Now it's 3% with 1% margin of error, whatever the case may be. Why does that matter to you and me? What does that actually mean for the country?
So I think it's a bit of history is important here. South Africa, for most of its history, battled high inflation. So all of us have, I'm sure Mark will remember this more than most of us, being from the Free State, parents who say to us, when I was a kid, I'd go to the grocery store with 20 Rand and I pay for groceries for a month.
Yeah.
And now it costs so much and I can't even buy a litre of petrol for that amount of money.
Yeah.
I'm sure we've all heard that story from our parents and our grandparents. So that's actually a reflection of the lived experience of South Africans, because 1960s, 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s, we had high double-digit inflation. And then in 2000, the Reserve Bank says we're adopting inflation targeting, and we're going to run inflation within a band of 3 to 6%. And then with the credibility of the bank, price setters now have an anchor of inflation expectations. They know that the bank will respond through interest rates and the amount of money supply and so on to contain inflation to within a band. So they start setting prices based on this. Obviously, they'll know this is inflation and they'll work on that. You might have costs that exceed inflation, but when you start setting prices, whether you're a municipality or a business, whatever, you'll start on inflation. So that meant that suddenly, instead of the rand losing, value every 10 years, prices double.
Yeah.
Suddenly, every 16 years, prices were doubling.
So it's stretching it out.
Stretching out, And so the story of when I was a kid, 20 rand would pay for my groceries for a month. Now okay, so
it's less drastic.
It's less drastic, considerably less drastic. But there's a few other things about inflation. I can. This is going to take a while. So buckle up, because inflation's an interesting topic. So the government ran the band 3 to 6%, and then the intention was always that you go lower, and over time you'd get to a lower target. Then there was an emerging market currency crisis in 2001, and the conversation never really went further. But because there was this wide band of 3 to 6, generally people presumed 6, and so prices went up around 6%.
Yep.
Then in 2017, a very great man, Lesetja Kganyago, became the governor of the Reserve Bank, and he announces we're now targeting the midpoint of the band. So we're going, the government says the band is 3 to 6, we're going to go for the midpoint 4.5. And then prices start coming down, or inflation rather stops rising. So prices stop going up by the 6% because price setters know if we try to squeeze more out to maximize our margins and so on, the bank's going to act and it's going to raise rates.
Yeah.
And so we know from the credibility of how the bank acts, we have got to work within their band and tolerance band, and inflation starts coming down and settles in at 4.5%. Now, of course, the government's agreed. Instead of having this band of 3 to 6 with an implicit target of 4.5, we're going to go for 3 with a tolerance band either way, in case there are shocks. Let's just say there's an oil crisis somewhere and inflation runs, it can run up to 4%. So that's the broad strokes of the history of inflation targeting. But you asked the most important question: what does this mean for you or me? At 4.5%, the price of a loaf of bread would double in 16 years. At 3%, it doubles in 24 years. Now,
at the 6% of the double in 2 years.
Exactly. 6%. No, 6%. It would double in 10 years.
Yeah.
So, and in 1980s inflation, it would double every 2 years. Yes.
Correct.
So you don't really want to do that to people. Now, think about this in the structure of our economy. You have 16 million people in social grants, and people who hustle to get by, whose earnings or remittances, they're very meager, and who have, insecure job. They might have a job one day a week and so on. The earnings for lots of people are very low. Do you want them to be able to afford basic goods or not? Yeah. And I actually said this at Parliament. I said, with the new target, we are now saying to people, instead of choosing between toothpaste and food, we're trying to make sure that they can afford both.
Yeah.
Now that's for poor people. If you're in the middle class and you want to buy a house, do you want inflation to be so high that you're choosing between paying your home loan and food? Because when inflation goes up, rates go up.
Correct.
But if inflation is anchored and stable, you over time, as your earnings grow, your home loan won't grow aggressively either, because inflation is what will kill your debt situation and make you make choices between these things. But by anchoring inflation expectations, for example, it's better for the middle class to ultimately take on good debts and home loans and so on, build assets and so on. There is a misnomer that we should just let inflation run higher and it'll be good for people. It won't, because ultimately rates will move higher as well, and you'll erode more and more of people's incomes, and the value of what they can do with their money declines. And then lastly, what does if we want to be attractive for investment, we've got to be in line with other emerging markets. If you are a wealthy country like the United States, most of the European Union and so on, it's not even a debate. Inflation is at 2%. The banks have targeted 2%. I think Paul Vlocker in the 1990s started inflation
70s.
targeting way back when, but they started at 3% in the US and then dropped to 2%. In most emerging markets have moved to a 3% target. We are at 4.5%. If I'm an investor and I'm going to invest in South Africa, or I'm going to invest in another emerging market, and South Africa's 4.5 and the other market's 3. That means the value of my investment will erode more quickly in South Africa than the other emerging markets.
Correct.
So it goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
So for those 3 reasons, it matters.
That is incredible, because my very next question was going to be why or how does this impact jobs? And you're saying there's a direct correlation between that and the investment that we need to
Lower
create
inflation
jobs.
creates more jobs. It creates an environment for more jobs.
It creates the environment. So there's a very important phrase here: a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah.
If you have high inflation, you will not get good growth.
Yeah.
If you have low inflation, it is a necessary condition but not a sufficient condition for growth. There are other problems.
Yes.
You need cheap and reliable and stable electricity. You need good ports.
Yeah.
You need labor market flexibility. You need a regulatory environment as well. All these things need to come together.
Network,
Exactly.
et cetera.
There's lots of things. But if you have high inflation, all those other things won't make too much of a difference.
Yeah.
So it's good for the economy in the medium and long run. And that's what matters. You don't take decisions for 1 year. You take it for what will make South Africans better off over time. So it's a necessary condition, but not on its own a sufficient condition for growth.
Okay.
So those 8,000 ghost workers are going to create 8,000 jobs effectively as well.
Well, if we get those salaries back for sure, but at least we won't be inflation adjusting their
Here's the other thing, like people in government, trade unions, as the Reserve Bank governor always says, hate inflation so much they always want more money than inflation.
Yeah.
So you just give them less inflation, and then
And they have all the money.
And yet, that hasn't been the stance they have taken. I was listening to media commentary slamming the 3% inflation target. I was very confused.
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth touching on the counter arguments and indicating why they didn't make a lot of sense. But maybe just first to acknowledge that, Ashor is maybe one of 5 people I know that leans into this topic. That says, inflation targeting is really interesting.
I will admit I'd never heard that before. Inflation is very interesting.
It's quite wonkish, yeah.
Enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
It's kind of freaky.
We should have a show just for inflation, actually.
The Reserve Bank other was the second out of the 5 people I know. That's fine. But it is important, and it does affect people's lives. So maybe to touch on 2 sort of economic theories that play into this. The one is what's called the expectations theory. Ashor mentioned the Federal Reserve governor in the US in the 70s, Volcker. At some point, they realized that inflation was getting out of hand. I just want to take a step back and try and make this as simple as possible. When a central bank sees that inflation is running wild, the mechanism they most often use to try and combat that is to raise interest rates. And what that means is if you've got a loan outstanding, they'll make it more expensive to repay that loan. And they do that because as you make it more expensive for people to get access to credit, the people who would have had access to that credit now are less keen to spend. And when they are less keen to spend, that brings down demand. And when you bring down demand, then the price of goods don't go up as quickly as they would if there was excessive demand. Okay, so Economics 101, interest rates are used to try and control inflation by central banks. Now, Volcker in the 70s in the US, his central bank didn't have any credibility. People genuinely did not believe that they would raise interest rates sufficiently to try and combat inflation. Yeah. Their policy approach was incoherent. And they had to raise interest rates above 20%. It was so bad that car dealerships would send car keys and coffins to the Federal Reserve and say, like, you're killing our industry, you're killing our sales. Like, people can't get access to credit. And so they had to take some pretty wild steps to try and bring inflation under control. Now, fortunately in South Africa, our Reserve Bank doesn't have that credibility problem. There is an understanding that when they say something, they mean it. And so the expectation theory says that when your central bank has this sort of implied authority, sometimes they can just mention that they'll increase interest rates. They don't actually have to increase interest rates, and that by itself will cause the price setters to respond. This credibility aspect, I think, does undermine this counter-narrative that all of a sudden life's going to become very expensive, especially for the poor, because interest rates are going to go up. A second point to touch on there is that people say, well, poor people have a lot of outstanding debt, and that debt will become more expensive because the central bank has to raise the interest rate to try and combat inflation. But the fact is, people at the poorer end of the spectrum don't have access to as much credit.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so even on those grounds, maybe one other wonkish economic thing to mention, and I'll stop my soliloquy, is you also have what's called the sacrifice ratio. And as Ashor has now explained earlier, but I'll try and again simplify, if you had 2 numbers, you could say my inflation was either going to be 5% or it's going to be 3%. And if my economy now is worth 100 Rand, at the 5% inflation rate, it's my expectation that by next year this time, my economy on paper will be worth 105 Rand. And if my inflation was 3%, my economy will be worth 103. And so, but your risk there is your economy looks smaller on paper by next year. But actually all you've done is you've brought inflation under control, and you have the same sort of level of economic activity.
Yeah.
But so people are concerned about this thing called the sacrifice ratio, which is how much GDP growth are you sacrificing in pursuit of bringing your inflation under control. But the Reserve Bank's modeling on this, and by the way, people say that they haven't done enough consultation. They've been looking at this for 2 years, and actually before that for the last 30. But the the modeling indicates that you might have the sacrifice ratio of about 0.3% of GDP. And within a year, it'll be 0.25 to 0.4% of actual, economic growth because of the knock-on effects here. And definitely by 3 years, that will be the case. So you'll start to counteract that in a very short space of time. But yeah, so the counter arguments are almost sort of a knee-jerk. And I do fear sometimes that people want to be a bit intellectual. So they're like,
yes.
you've made a decision and now let's engage with it. Even if deep down you probably know it's a good decision, you're still like trying to just fight it because then you sound smart. I'm just concerned about are we doing the best thing for South Africa with the means at our disposal?
So what would, taking where we came from, taking where we are now with the medium-term budget as well, what is that sweet spot for inflation in your opinion? Where should we be sitting?
Well, so it's very dangerous to ask anyone in a finance policy.
That is a dangerous place.
It is the ultimately. The person the people who work in this is the Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
And it's as defined in the Constitution. They are required to make these decisions to protect the value of the country in the interest of sustainable economic growth.
Yeah.
That's the constitutional framing. So 3% is there. We said the band they must reach the 3% within 2 years. They've got space because you can't shock the market and do that in one go. But already the governor has cut interest. So this big fear that suddenly we're going to change the inflation target and then we're going to raise rates massively to achieve it. To literally had a rate cut. The reality is that from the time lag from the decision to the implementation is 24 months. That's from a monetary authority.
Yeah.
From it taking its decision, it reflecting the economy. So there's time and there's space to get there. 3% we know is good. Why do we know it's good? Because it's in line with our emerging market peers.
Yeah.
And it means that we will be as attractive a destination on this metric compared to other emerging markets.
And that's attractive in the sense of investment. And obviously investment brings jobs. I'm always going to drive jobs because it's a key focus of ours. But how more important was our fight to not allow the VAT increase? How more important was that fight in relation to keeping down inflation, but more so achieving our outcomes of creating more job opportunities, saving the economy? How more important was that VAT fight?
I'll let Mark handle this one since he took most of the beating in Parliament.
Ashor said something really important earlier, this necessary but sufficient. A lot of people think of monetary policy as a way which inflation targeting is a subset of. This is your monetary policy. There's this thinking that says, if we just get monetary policy right, the economy will grow. That's just not right.
Yeah.
And likewise, when my last British reference for today, when they were able to successfully evacuate the British forces at the start of the Second World War, Churchill made this roaring speech in Parliament. He said, wars are not won by retreat. And we haven't won any war with this. We won a battle on the VAT issue. But that, much like inflation targeting, is necessary but sufficient conditions for economic growth. But what we need to get economic growth going, to create jobs, is a reform of our key sectors, especially transport and especially electricity. So historically, Eskom has been unreliable, and now it's still expensive. So we need to rapidly get alternatives to Eskom into the market so that we can bring down the cost of electricity and make sure that it will always be there. If we're successful in our inflation targeting, we're still going to face this problem where Eskom is increasing its prices way above inflation. And electricity, of course, is an input cost to industry. So any business that wants to run has to pay for electricity. And if that's still increasing above inflation, other projects will have to compensate more. Likewise with the VAT that you now ask about, it was supremely important to shift the Overton window, to change the culture, to get us all focused and never just willy-nilly increase taxes again.
Yes.
At the same time, we need the rail network to work. We need our ports to become not the worst in the world. And it's one of the biggest bottlenecks for Cape Town and the Western Cape's economy is this Transnet-run port in Cape Town. We need these things to work, and then we need a bunch of other structural reform, including, I'm sure Ashor will chat a bit about some of the municipal reform that's needed. And those things will be the things that create jobs. But you can't do those things if you haven't fixed these things that we're now, trying to win and at times successful in winning the battles on.
I give you an example. the central line, you talk about rail, the central line was down for many years through COVID, after COVID. And I know of people that gave up their jobs. They had low paying jobs, but they gave up their jobs because it cost them more money to get to work, because they had to take taxi after taxi after bus. That central line alone, that if it just worked and it worked effectively, those individuals would be saving they'd be saving 2/3 of their disposable income could be going into savings.
Yeah. So here's an interesting fact on that. South Africa and Vietnam have similar per capita incomes, particularly on the low end of the scale. And this was in the DA's manifesto, so if you haven't read it yet, it's every home should have one.
Thanks for updating me on that.
Yes. But in South Africa, a worker will spend potentially up to 60% of their monthly income on transport to get to work. In Vietnam, they spend 10%.
Oh, wow.
Look at the difference.
So what does that, if you're spending so much in transport, how are you still paying for food? How are you still paying for electricity? How are you still paying for school fees? How are you still paying for textbooks and shoes, healthcare, etc.? And so really, these are, when I speak about the, necessary but sufficient conditions and so on, one of the things is, for example, making cheap, accessible transport available to South Africans, because the current system obviously isn't working.
Yeah.
And so we need, so here, PRASA actually is a drag on low-income people. So what is the case for lots of competition in the private sector is price stability. And you can only get price stability through competition, because then you get a market equilibrium price. If the price setter is always government, we've seen through South Africa's economic history now that when government sets the price, government sets inflation, inefficiency and corruption, and you pay for that in the price every year. So,
it's the joys of having a monopoly, I guess, eh?
But it's true for any monopoly structure. Monopolies are bad things, whether they're public or private. Monopolies are not good things.
I think one of the key places we've seen it in South Africa is the cell phone networks, where we at the start we just had the one, and prices were outrageous. The price of data was crazy, but now you've got more suppliers in the market, and there's actual competition. You speak about the UK. I'd spent some time there as well. I was amazed to see that you could buy gas from 3 or 4 or 5 different suppliers. You didn't just need to buy your power from Eskom. So will we get to that point in this country where we actually are opening it up to the consumer, opening it up to competition, and effectively making it cheaper for the consumer?
Yeah, one of the things that the ANC and the DA agree on is that we need to move to a competitive energy market. Obviously, the DA would
would have done it already.
The DA would have done 1990s shock therapy on this.
Stop it,
change it. But there's general agreement on electricity. It's great that we don't have load shedding right now, and we've got stability of supply. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for what we need. And I'll keep using that phrase, because if the electricity price. So when I finished high school and started university, load shedding started. I was a teenager. I finished high school at 17. And I'm now 37, and the risk is with some grey hairs. And the risk of load shedding is ever present, and has been like for half my life. All of my adult life.
You've worried about load shedding,
exactly. So, but the other thing that happened in 2007 is, for those first 3 years, electricity prices went up 33% a year.
Yeah.
And then it's been well above inflation. If you want growth, you have got to make sure that firms don't have to choose between hiring new staff and paying their electricity.
Yeah.
And that's and again, electricity is an inflation driver, and that inefficiency. So to sort this out, you need a competitive market. Now, the Electricity Regulation Act imagines a future, or plans for a future, where you do have a competitive market. You've got the wholesale market, you've got transmission, distribution, generation separated, and you've got the competitive generating market that sells into the system and then distributes it by, and then the market equilibrium price is set at the center. And then you don't have a single point of failure that can chokehold the entire economy.
Correct, because it is different supplies.
Yep.
Look, let me tell you, the city is doing just that one thing. The city is looking at various ways of powering up and getting electricity. So they'll even pay you for instance, if you have these solar panels, they'll pay you for the electricity you don't use that goes into storage. Now, the long-term effect of that is that we're able to provide indigent relief to many people, where a lot of poor people don't pay for services. They don't pay for rates, they don't pay for water, because we're able to subsidize that through innovative ideas that we are doing to be able to make more money and to keep the lights on.
Alan Wendy also spoke about, I think in George, they're doing a pilot. An intern, he said, developed an app for trading electricity. So there's a lot of innovation happening. What I would like to sort of get to grips with, I have a 16-year-old who is writing exams. So my life has been spider diagrams, Venn diagrams, trying to put concepts together. Mark, you spoke about structural reform. So what does that mean? And what is the relationship of that to something like Operation Vulindlela? And obviously within that falls some of these things that we've been talking about. Break that down.
Yeah, so Operation Vulindlela, for our listeners, and maybe another point for our listeners at home, the city, Angus was referring to the city of Cape Town.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry.
It's not Johannesburg.
The functioning one.
It's not Joburg yet.
Right, there we
Doesn't
go.
my face say Cape Town, though?
Fair enough. For our viewers at home, the Operation Vulindlela is a program run out of the presidency that is meant to accelerate some of these reforms that we've now been talking about. And they've done some decent things. The challenge is that it's not fast enough. And so let's unpack some examples of what reforms we need. When we say the rail network needs to come alive and service industry and get our farmers' produce to ports and so on, that has a bunch of components in it. It has private sector participation on the rail network. So you have these train companies that's not Transnet that runs carriages and locomotives on our rail network. That bit of sort of devolution and participation of the private sector has been enacted, and they've received bids and so on. But likewise, you need to get private sector participation in the actual rail network itself. So building that out, maintaining it, and so on. You need it in the signaling system, and there's about 30 to 40 entities that sits within Transnet. And we need to see a reform of how this behemoth entity is run in a way that introduces more of the competition that Angus spoke about earlier, so that people could say, well, the price and the timing on this carriage is going to be that, but if I pick this other service provider that runs overnight, it'll be priced slightly differently, and for my particular product, I can afford for it to be 12 hours later, but I pay a bit less, and so on. You don't have that level of optionality at the moment with one counterparty that is Transnet. With electricity, again, it has a bunch of things in it. Electricity can broadly be understood as these three things, which is where you generate the power, how you distribute it, and how it then finally is billed and utilized at the individual level. Otherwise known as, help me out here, generation, transmission, and distribution. But at each one of those levels, you can also have competition. So what Angus mentioned earlier is the ability to say, well, out of these 5 companies that can bill me, I'm going to pick this one. And they will in turn say, out of these 10 generators, I can pick that one. And so you need that level of competition. Now, what I will say here is something that Ashor often reminds me of is, it feels to us super slow and frustrating, and why is Eskom so prevalent, and why does it not work, and why is it so expensive? But then serious organizations that have looked at how other countries have gone from complete state control to more private sector participation, look at South Africa and say, you guys have done this devolution of this function in record time. We've never seen deregulation at that pace. Well done, keep going. And so that should give us some encouragement. It's not sufficient, but already, the fact that the lights are actually on, even though it's expensive, is a direct result of private sector participation in our electricity grid.
Sure, but Mark, that is difficult to swallow. It's great to hear.
It's necessary, but not sufficient.
Exactly. It is wonderful that we're apparently doing it faster, but I got to tell you, it's barely perceptible as just a human walking around.
And that's almost as it should be, in that, like, you need not notice that electricity is working. Like, you're allowed to assume in 2025 that electricity should work. And you should then almost be outraged and say, why is it so expensive? I need it to be a lot cheaper so that I stop thinking about it, so I can go think about things that actually create economic value. It's not normal for a population of 60 million people to all be concerned about how much electricity is costing and where's it going to come from.
It's not normal for 60 million people to take turns sharing electricity either.
Yes.
So, I mean, look, I think the key thing is, you say about noticing change and so on. The thing about getting change is that if you take lots of cumulative steps over time, each of those steps are small. The end result is impactful and big, but you don't notice it.
Yeah.
And so you can do a shock to the system. Absolutely, you can. And then maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. And then, maybe things that people are better off, maybe people are worse off. But that's why it's not good public policy to shock the system.
Yeah.
So let's use Umgeni an example. The people who are cutting the grass there, are sweeping the streets and so on, are keeping the municipality clean, are the same people who were there when the ANC ran the municipality. You could have gone in and just fired everyone. You'd be trapped in the labor courts. Yeah. And you'd be fighting with unions and so on, and the streets would be none the cleaner. They might even be worse. So you could fight, or you could say, where is my problem? Is my problem middle management? Is my problem the fact that people are too lazy to actually just draw up a schedule of work? Is anyone inspecting what they're doing? And all those cumulative steps mean the grass is cut on time, the refuse is collected.
Ashor, I know what you're saying, okay? It doesn't make me feel better right now. I'm going to the gym and I have lost weight just over like 18 months. I wish I'd just taken Ozempic. I want the results yesterday.
I did 25 in 3 months.
On Ozempic.
That is crazy.
No.
I did 10 and 18 months.
25 in 3 months.
Well done,
All I'm saying,
Deep austerity measures.
I want the radical, okay?
But literally 25 in 3 months. You remember the first show we did?
Yeah.
The first show we ever did. I mean, I've got a photo of it. And if I look at myself on Sunday, coming, when everyone else watches this, versus that first one, you can see the difference completely.
Amazing.
Angus, I resent you.
Oh, no, celebrate your wins. Much like South Africa should celebrate our wins.
I resent you, so I'm changing the subject.
No. Go back to it. You're going to the gym, which is a good thing.
There is so much more to unpack from the budget. I could keep you all night.
Yeah, it's
but
amazing.
Somebody has a lovely new baby, so I don't think I should keep you here all night.
Is it keeping your austerity measures at home?
On that score, can I ask each of you to pick, it can be something we've discussed, something we haven't discussed, pick your favorite thing out of this budget season, out of everything we've managed to do, anything you've worked on, what's your absolute favorite achievement?
I'm sure Ash is going to tell you a bit about municipalities, but I won't speak for him.
Tell us about municipalities, Mark.
So, look, I think the big thing, the most important thing is metro trading services. I'm not sure how much time we have left to explain all of this, but we'll make the most. Okay, so right now, when you pay your municipal utility bill, that's a big word to get out. When you pay for your bill from the municipality every month, it goes into the general account, the big bank account of the municipality, and they can spend it however they want.
Yeah.
They can spend it on fixing the leaky pipes. They can spend it in hiring a new advisor for the mayor or sending him an overseas trip or her, or they can spend it on beadworking projects. It doesn't. It's up to them. With the reforms that we're doing, what the critical thing is that municipalities now have to ring fence, starting with water, their water entities. So when you pay your water bill, that can't then be spent on a political advisor for the mayor.
Or an upgraded car.
It has to go back into the water entity.
Correct.
And then they will have to firstly sort out their maintenance, pay their water board, do their future infrastructure build, and only if there's surplus left over after that can it go back into the general exchequer. So I think that's a big thing, because what it means is it's a critical way to stabilize water in our metros, where if you're in Joburg or you're in eThekwini or parts of Tshwane or parts of Ekurhuleni or elsewhere, we've had load shedding. Now we take turn sharing water, and I live in Ekurhuleni, so I know this firsthand. I do take turn sharing water with the other suburbs around me. So I mean, we're going to do this with all the trading services. And that's a critical reform. But the other thing is that there's money now from the World Bank. So every rand that they spend in infrastructure will match with the rand from the World Bank on a particular kind of finance vehicle that we've got into the system. And the EFF aren't happy about it in Parliament, but that's fine. They don't like us using World Bank money. But the critical thing is, it's cheap money at low interest, and it will enable us to then invest in the massive water infrastructure backlog, and then the massive energy infrastructure backlog, and then the refuse removal backlog, and then the sewage and sanitation backlog, all of those trading services that you pay for month to month. And then we will have stable services across our country if we get this right. But also people are to vote for the right local government leaders to execute the plan.
Implement,
Well, that is fascinating. So they would rather have their voters sharing water than use cheap World Bank money to fix.
Well, let's see what happens. With the program started, it's running at pace. Let's see what happens. But I suspect right now, the City of Cape Town will probably be the most effective implementer of the program.
It sounds amazing.
We've implemented in the last budget. We've implemented, and electricity is electricity, water is water. But we've been able to manage it so effectively that we're almost at that point where we are able to grow and spend more money on infrastructure in those various departments because of how we're managing the process. We've got one of the highest return rates in terms of people paying
That is amazing.
in the country.
That's awesome. Mark, what's your favorite?
A culture change.
Same one.
Yeah, bear with me. We've had a lot of numbers today. This isn't a perfect matchup, but it's a good way of understanding it. The DA at the moment has about 22% of the national vote, and about 22 rand out of every 100 is spent on debt as a nation at the moment. And it's my contention that, and the data is now showing it, that as our share of the vote will go up, so the share of our revenue that we spend on interest payments will go down.
Yeah.
And that's a direct result of this culture change that we've been able to effect as a result of being in the room where some of these decisions are made. So we've touched on some of these things today, the ghost workers and, inflation targeting and more efficient spending and actually being able to start ticking off the things you need for your economy to have a fighting chance. But all of that can be surmised for me in a willingness now to engage in some of these things. A lot still has to happen, and we need to get through February's budget cycle, and I'm sure next year will come with its own set of fights and uncertainty and turbulence. But it's my read of the sentiment in South Africa at the moment that people want to be a bit more hopeful, and there are reasons if we can get these things right, if our voice of reason in the DA is being listened to within the corridors of national power, that we will be able to start chipping back at this debt burden, that we will be able to fund the things that we need, and that we won't have to tax South Africans more to do it. And anyway, that's why I'm getting up in the morning. That's that's the journey we're on.
So Ashor, quick fire, the top 5 things that have stood out for you in the medium-term budget. Top 5.
I mean, we discussed them all. Inflation, obviously debt to GDP peak, metro trading services reform. Number 4, we didn't talk about it, but it's very important. Changing the way government spends money from consumption to investment, more fixed assets. And then the last thing is the growth forecasts for next year is, at this stage, at least at population growth, so we stop getting poorer on average.
Yeah.
And what you're currently reading?
What am I currently reading? I'm reading a book on Poland and its economic growth. It's by a professor, I forget the title. And basically, there's lots about the developmental state in like Asia and what they did. But Poland has gone from like in the 90s being, when it was released from the Soviet Union, poorer than South African average, is now the 20th largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a completely different model to the developmental state.
Yeah.
So I'm reading about that because obviously it's important to challenge hegemony at all times.
Absolutely.
And to not let a single idea and pathway of thinking dominate. And so that's my next thing is like, what are the alternative models that get to growth? Because Poland is an example of getting very wealthy. I don't want the kind of democratic backsliding we see there, but I do want their growth.
You must follow the president of Poland. Look, it's all he speaks Polish in all his videos, but he's managed to capture that country in a way like never before through social media. Unbelievable.
And Mark, what are you reading?
I am reading at a very slow pace because of the 2-month-old you mentioned earlier. I'm reading Tom Holland's Dominion, which is, have you read it?
This is not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, to be clear.
Different Tom Holland.
No, I read Rubicon and I'm waiting for Dominion.
You can have it once I'm done. Give me a bit of time though. It's about I guess Christianity as we understand it now, but also the shaping of the Western mind. At the same time, I'm also reading a fun book that I intend to Ashor when I'm done called Edible Economics. the title caught my attention. So far, it's pretty good.
Is it more economics or more edible?
Well, it's an economics professor, I think, out of SOAS in London. I forget which school he's associated with, of South Korean extraction. And so he explains economic concepts and approaches based on, how food behaves. So he's also a foodie, and he's quite elegantly meshed the two into a book, and I'm quite enjoying it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so the last thing that I want to know is, within the GNU, looking forward when we have this conversation next year, what do you want to achieve? What do you think is possible? What are you excited to see when we have this interview next year?
I'm not a member of the GNU. I'm a humble backbench parliamentarian providing oversight on the GNU, but I hope that, folks will keep listening to each other. I hope that we'll embrace this spirit of compromise. And yeah, I thought about this a lot, and I wonder if folks can actually start articulating their reason for pursuing certain policies or ideas, as opposed to, catching onto the things that they think is popular. So I want this policy because it benefits that constituency, as opposed to saying, we need more state control, but you don't really mean what you're saying. You just don't want to engage with us on how Transnet needs to be devolved. So I think if people can keep acting with integrity and articulating their reasons for preferences, I think that will lead to quite a constructive, collaborative space. And I want to be clear also that I think that that's what South Africans want.
Yeah.
They really don't want to, if needed, they need to see us standing firm as we did on the VAT issue. But I think on the whole, what they want is for us to find ways to serve them. So I hope that's what the guys are able to do in the GNU.
In a year's time, what do I want? This is an interesting question, because all of the big bang reforms have been done now.
Yeah.
I suppose it's more microeconomic interventions, things like what can we do on making sure that the public transport system works so that people can spend more money on themselves and not on getting to work. And people shouldn't be working to pay to go to work, for example. Electricity price stability and the things that need to happen there. So there's quite a lot. But now that the macroeconomic reforms are done, it's pushing hard on the microeconomic reforms. There's still some structural things around the way we look at industrial policy and so on. Not in my portfolio, but things that choke growth. And certainly you've got to keep picking the fights, keep fighting hard, standing your corner. Know that the parties that are in government with you also have firm views. And we're not here to agree. Otherwise, the voters would have voted for one of us and not all of us. But we've got to keep persuading each other, and hopefully they listen to me more than everyone else.
Sorry, can I just say one thing? Because you said now that the big macros are done, you're focusing on the micros, and I need to be certain that I understand the macros. So when you say the macros are done, I mean, we're still sort of in the pipeline with electricity, with whatever. Which parts are you saying are the macros that are done?
Debt to GDP, inflation. So macro and fiscal policy, basically, which is prioritize investment over consumption. That's macroeconomic. Microeconomic are what are the things at a household and firm level that you need to do to get better growth. So that's micro, is household and firm. Macro is the national institutions and what they do.
Okay, so debt to GDP, you said?
Debt to GDP, inflation, and composition of expenditure.
So two things from me, last two things. The one thing we haven't spoken about, and I think it's really great news, is our removal as a country from the grey list. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a long journey. We had 22 action items that we needed to do to get off the grey list. And some of it was in legislative reform, for example, beneficial ownership. So it's one thing, you can register a company, it can be all opaque and so on. And then I might be the beneficial owner who receives the money, but it's opaque, and so nobody really knows that I'm the guy profiting from this business or benefiting from this business. So we did all the legal reform, but then we had to do reforms around criminal justice. We had to have a sustained increase in prosecutions and charges on financial crimes. And that is, we've seen with the Madlanga commissions. So we had to have a sustained demonstrate to FATF that we were doing this. It was a difficult thing to do, but the fact that we pulled it over the line is quite important. And we're off the grey list, which means that we have easier financial transactions now, easier than we would before, because there's less compliance for international actors to work with the South African financial system. So it was a long journey. It was 2 years, but it's done. And the hard part, which when you look at the Madlanga Commission, makes you worry about the state of our criminal justice system. But at least on the financial side, we were able to demonstrate that we can do that. We've got to keep doing it. We've got to keep doing more of it.
Absolutely. So we campaigned in the last election on a slogan of Rescue South Africa. And I really want to take the opportunity on behalf of myself and my colleague, and I think all of South Africans. We not only rescued South Africa, we are rescuing South Africa through the interventions that both yourself, Mark, and you,
100%.
Ashor, is doing within Treasury. And I think a lot of people don't understand the extent of Treasury. Treasury ensures that every other department works and that every other department gets what they need to get to make work. So well done, Ashor. You're doing an absolutely amazing job.
Amazing.
Mark, well done.
Cheers.
Keep pushing. I'd like to see VAT come down even further next year, Mark. Thanks for doing for us. But thank you very much. It's been an awesome show. Whoever thought that we could have fun for an hour and a half talking about finance?
Imagine that.
Well done, guys.